Once upon a time, our protagonist was brought together in an explosion of gas, at first multiplying and oozing as microbes, but soon learning to swim in the surrounding primordial sludge with squelched out legs that they used to pull themselves onto land. When on land, they developed a kind of sentient thought that perceived the world as an environment of criteria, situations, and objects that were to be automatically and instinctively reacted to in order to achieve survival and expansion. They picked up the world around them and formed crude tools to thrive with, and bred fire from flint and wood, and soon their brains enlarged and their thought processes evolved past that of simple reaction and instinct, and they began to link their surroundings with connections and memory, and turn their survival data into a world to inhabit, roam, and call home. They began to create a complex semiotic language they used to communicate intricately between themselves, a vast evolving structure of crafted noises that cultivated and expanded their consciousness, and plethora of newfound emotion, to the point that they formed tribes and troops that grew into strongholds and societies, where agriculture blossomed and survival was sustained. A language intrinsically linked to the newfound, but always present foundation of mathematics, established to correlate nature in their new cultures, where, within the shelter of forged columns, they analysed the fast-rising attitudes and hegemonies that were growing like baby-fresh limbs inside their crowds and courts, and from there formed laws and ideologies to affirm their progress, and philosophy and culture to expand and feed it. With each step of expanding leg, they learnt of new layers and uncertainties. From these newly emerged hierarchies and rulings, there spread a search for everything, and more, that they first glimpsed at with the concept of gods, almighty and all-knowing, totems of the unknowing nature of nature. Beneath them sat the kings and emperors of they, proclaiming their appointment of such roles through their own self-proclaimed notions of blood. They traversed and studied the land before them, stomping and absorbing any foreign and distant opposition, spreading and evolving with each cultural war of ideological terraforming. And their knowledge grew. Little logics and reasonings for the ebb and flow of the land. They chiselled away at the world and at their theories. Such actions bred enhanced technologies and creations that began to make primitive physicality rather obsolete in the majority of society. As the new food chains were refined, so too was society itself, its principles and lifestyles emblazoned and ingrained more effectively so on each passing generation. And from here, their world and its ideal was formed and fashioned, with a doctrine built upon these ideals and yet simultaneously working towards its perceived perfection, the new world of our protagonist, its primary principle being it must be the only world, displacing all others. A world of ideals, a republic of liberalised democratic individuality, a nation and horde of individuals evenly represented by their own chosen hierarchy, packed into buildings that would be the living machines of the future. Their post-industrial adaptations and the certainty of principles from where their logocentric ideals had formed created a strict rationality of the world, and this, in turn, led soon to a so-called Great War of forced globalisation and unification that utter brutality shocked the masses. A war between the new world's muddled individualistic ideals and the old world's slackening aristocratic grip of prehistoric hegemonies. A war that sprouted from the ideological tensions of a world growing far smaller. A war that resulted in a shocking but inevitable victory for the new world, whose own subsequent siege of cultural terraforming prolonged the conflict into another, bloodier war. The success of the new world's ideals had formed binary opposites to their visions. In this new war they found themselves fighting intensified modernist rationalism that would do all in its terrible power to exterminate the perceived weaker chains of its hierarchy, including turning these lower rungs into some alien race so that they could be eliminated without emotion. The new world's belief in the governed state of self created this hard, fascist, primitive extreme, which was eventually, and once again inevitably, cut down, and, as if our protagonist's enemies grew heads like a hydra as their rhetoric spread around the globe, another extreme from the opposite end of the spectrum then seemingly reared up from underneath this corpse to hand the heels of our protagonist's muddling ideals also, ideals already shaken by the most sickeningly brutal war ever seen. And in the aftermath of this divisive war, an intellectual principle was affirmed that had loomed over life since the advent of thought: doubt. Science became a practice and study of doubt. Thinkers and artists grappled with doubt. Politics became the suspension of doubt. As our protagonist's new enemy spread throughout the war-torn territories of the post-war world, it began to act as a mirror to our protagonist's doubts, and these binary opposites seem to look more like extremes, extremities even. In their enemy's strict ideals of rationalism through action and control, our new world protagonist's patchy upholding of ideals was highlighted. They saw how they too exercised brutal hierarchies, the dream of complete communal individualism, crushed by a lack of empathy and a chokehold-like emphasis on tradition and superiority. The newly displaced fell by the wayside, the other was held down, and their own foggier Übermensch was still upheld in religious and societal practices and doctrines. The unknowing and unachievable absurdist nature at the heart of all cultural and political practice reared its ugly head with cannibalising critique and chaotic expansion. The world opened up wide, and a new, colder kind of war was affirmed to represent this new grey age. Some in the new world faced all this doubt by retracting backwards and inwards. To clearer ideals, this was largely hopeless. There was no going back. Soon, however, the cold rationalism of the apparent enemy is projected as defeated through empty threats and lunacy. It is then inevitably smothered over by our protagonist's insecurities, but ideals are further shaken. The pursuit of happiness solely remains as the world becomes the size of our protagonist. The protagonist plunged into existential angst by the newly discovered, quivering state of existence. Governments are seemingly exposed as headless chickens, pursuing subjective notions of peace and are increasingly undermined by the new pursuit of happiness era supreme being like corporations and institutions, as everything smoothly runs amok in doubt. Things trying to satisfy our protagonist with convenience and comfort and imminent, instantaneous entertainment by filling the structures of language and communication with the binary opposite of animal fear of survival, and the doubt in the world with certainties in a steadily increasing, user-generated world. Art veers out of control with vivid freedom. Science shrugs and continues, accepting uncertainty and ending up all the better for it, as technology and mechanics accelerate virtually beyond belief, and ultimately beyond complete comprehension and practical demonstration. Suddenly, our protagonist's post-new world goes hyper-real and virtual, hyper-realistically smaller than their own cuticle, a series of platforms that perform ultimate globalization. This insane and heedlessly absurd globalization is spread through user-generated memes, inadvertently liquidating culture. The protagonist's babies, who are raised in this time of extreme doubt, of identity crisis and cultural, scientific, historical and information liquidation, are then largely unaware of its inherent absurdity, and their brains are hard-pressed to cope with the massive flux of life, i.e. data. This new world is a world where the author of the fairy tale has died, and those who were once the recipient of data become the data and spread the data and alter the success of communication and culture. In corners, growing against the doubt, fundamentalism and extremism rear their heads to clash with the open deconstruction of ideal that have rendered our protagonist a boiling pot of flailing fears and desires. They retaliate violently against this modern, postmodern, neo-postmodern state of things that seems to so impossibly satisfy the inner caveman of the future. Blood is spilt in their attempt to spread fear, a fear that ultimately gives way to more doubt and more absurdity. A conquest of headless romanticism, the incurable romanticism of ideals. Our protagonist is in conflict with himself completely. Those grand narratives of the past, had they truly occurred? History itself is thrown into constant question for our protagonist. Our protagonist's coming of age, our protagonist's childhood and education and identity. Our protagonist wonders whether it was the globalizing winners who wrote the world's bloodlines into being as black and white structures, evolving with the telling like fish bones. Did anyone actually won? Can any of it be proven or known? Supreme doubt within the fairy tale itself. Did any of it happen, or mean anything? Our protagonist sees that all of it happened and none of it happened. Our protagonist sees perception, the different perspectives that sprout from every single angle and nook and cranny of history. They see that those privileged to have been reared in intelligence-nurturing environments, devoid of fear of survival due to the intensely globalised and gentrified nature of the new world, can find themselves freed by this doubt and its questioning acceptance of things as they unknowingly are. They see this as they watch others flail and recede and fight for dying things without considering one another in the continued, unaccepted absurdity of things, and history ends for our protagonist as existence becomes infinite with capacity. History eats itself, those multi-limbed lines of grand narratives merging into white canvases. Our protagonist dreams of the inevitable futures, the modern and the now, the theories and fashions and systems and access and freedom that will sweep up and alter the concept of existence. They dream of themselves like an angel in a sort of cyberspace heaven, where all fantasy and desire is instantaneously delivered, processed and materialised in an undulating existential construction, where living is an externalised process in a universe of pure perception, in 4 dimensions, 5 dimensions, 6 dimensions more. Maybe these physical presences will be transcended. Maybe our protagonist's dreams will become parallel realities they can travel to in an incomprehensible form of emotional/negative travel. Maybe our protagonist's bodies and brains become machines. Maybe our protagonist's future holds time, space, matter, thought, presence, memory, language, and life itself as merely subjective and often deceitful. The future becomes an overwhelming, shape-shifting shadow that dissolves the withheld concepts of living entirely from the modern brain, and the protagonist shifts in form with it as they theorise. As they dream of a complete collective consciousness, godlike and outside the limits of current pragmatic physicality, out beyond the realms of stars and planets and space, and floating in an ethereal fabric of all things and more, where they can absorb and generate and mould matter and emotions and memory like clay or food, where the strands of all things run in little codes down the body of existence, where nothing is known and everything is known, and everything makes sense and nothing makes sense, where the constitution of being is a malleable thing, and yet still evolution teeters on. And during these dreams, our protagonist is struck with a thing called cancer. They topple, their last thoughts still questioning, wanting to embrace and evolve with romanticism and nihilism, and neo-postmodernism and fundamentalism further with every breath of their being, and then suddenly, as the land grows onward, they die. The rest, as all things, is not known. The end, I suppose.